there, but I'll speak from here, I think. This is just published this year.
Yes, in February. And it will be published, I think, next February in the UK and the US.
Very nice. It's very interesting indeed. Don't know why we're waiting, but we're waiting for the sign to start. Ok. Allora, possiamo cominciare?
I would say that we can start. Good afternoon, everybody. I will spend a few words in Italian, and then we will use English as the working language, since I'm Scottish and she's French, and English is the second language for both of us. The matter at hand is very interesting and important, and it is the future of the press and the future of media. I switch to English.
The translation. I'm John Lloyd. I'm founder of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, and a contributing editor to the Financial Times. And we're here with Julia Cagé, who is a professor at Sciences Po in Paris, an economist, professor of economy, and a member of the National Committee of Economists, which advises the government in France. And we're here to discuss her book, this book, which, as you will see, has got many scribbles on it because it's so interesting and so stimulating. And it's called Sauver les médias, Capitalisme, Financement Participatif et Démocratie. It is about c'è un problema? C'è un problema per tutti? Sì. Forse è il mio microfono, no? You're staying on. But it's good. Yeah, it's a real shame. There's a lot of people speaking. My colleague Martin Wolf from the FT is speaking immediately after this. I might try and go to that, although he starts at 5. Maybe we'll probably end at 5:30. Lots of Paul Cook. Had Stiglitz talked last night. Yeah.
Provo il canale 2, ma lui non mi sente. Provo il canale 2. No, va fuori il canale.
Thought of this festival want me to try again, or?
I obey to what they tell me.
Okay.
Just, well, sorry again.
Okay. A Bompiani, too. They were quicker. Who did you do your PhD with at Harvard? No, I live in London. Or I live sort of between London and Italy. My wife teaches in university in Pavia, near Milan. Yeah, indeed. But my son is an actor in the Royal Shakespeare Company in London. He's now playing in The Merchant of Venice, which is one of the great, if somewhat anti-Semitic plays, as you know. It's interesting this Shakespeare Company got to play Shylock, who's the central character of Merchant of Venice. He is the Merchant of Venice, and he's Jewish. Of course, everybody, all the Christians, spit on him, condemn him. Now, tutto bene? Funziona? Ok. Ricominciare. Okay. I was at the point where we were switching to English. So, again, a brief introduction of Julia Cagé, who is a professor of economics at Sciences Po and a member of a committee of economists who advise the government. She has written a book, this one here, Sauver les médias, to save the media, to save journalism, which has just been published and will soon be published in this country by Bompiani and in English as well. And it's an interesting book and it's an important book because, as she will say, I think, in her presentation, which will be in a minute. Non funziona? Funziona? No. Uffa. Sì, funziona. Ma non funziona per tutti. Posso continuare o c'è sempre un problema? Funziona? No, sì. Sì, no. Sì, ok. Continuare. It's an important and interesting book because there is a large problem with the media, with journalism. And that is, as she will say, a kind of mixture. On the one hand, there has never been so much information so readily available to so many people. On the other hand, many of the great institutions of the media and the great institutions of journalism are, if not dying, looking unhealthy, not very healthy. So, Julia is going to speak for about 40-45 minutes to present her ideas and also her proposal, because this isn't just an analysis, it's also a proposal for what can be done about the situation in our media. Julia.
Okay, perfecto. I am very happy to be there. I am very sorry not to be able to do it in Italian. Okay, I think there is a big issue with, information transmission, but we will try to solve the information issue at least today. So, like, my talk will be about inequality, democracy, and the future of the media, and especially, the fact that in general there is, with rising inequality in the world, there is a big risk. There is a big risk that money will increasingly corrupt, politics, and you saw rich people that increasingly use their resources to influence electoral, legislative, and regulatory process. They do it through campaign contributions, they do it through lobbying, and another way that they tend to do it is through the financing of the media. And one of the things that I'm going to argue today is that if you want to preserve democracy, you need to preserve the definition of democracy, which is one person, one vote, and not $1, one vote, or €1, one vote. Okay? And if you want to do that, especially if you consider the sector of the media, what you need to do is to think about a new economic and legal framework for the future of the media. I want to thank John Lloyd for the very nice introduction he did, and especially what he said about my book. So, in my book, which is called Save the Media, Capitalism, Crowdfunding, and Democracy, I am going to argue for a new model for the media at the intersection between shareholder companies and non-profit foundations. I'm going to conclude this presentation with this new model, but before that, I want to discuss with you, the big issues that the media are facing today. So there are three things, in a sense, in the crisis of the media, but they are linked. Like, the first one is the economic crisis, and I'm going to discuss a lot the fact that economically media tend to suffer both from the decrease in advertising revenues, the decrease in circulation. There is the issue of the trust in the media, and the trust in the media tends to be very low. This is something that is a fact in France, where less than 1/3 of the people tends to trust the media, and they think that the media are biased and that journalists are not telling us the truth. And if you take the number for Italy, in fact, trust in the media tends to be even lower than in France. And there is the issue of the decrease in the quality of the media and the decrease in the quality of the information that is provided by the media. And obviously, everything is linked, because if you have a decrease in the revenue of the media, then what they are going to do is that they are going to fire some journalists, they are going to reduce the size of their newsroom, and then you will see a decrease in the number of journalists, and then a decrease in the quality of the media. I will do like a presentation, in fact, in 4 parts. The first one will be devoted to the media crisis, and especially the long-term decline in the number of journalists that can be linked to the decrease, especially in advertising revenues. Then I will discuss solution and what could be done about it, and we will see that one of the bad solutions, but that tends to develop more and more all over the world, is the fact that you have new persons, the guy that I tend to call the new press barons, that are going to invest money in the media. Okay, they are going to invest money in the media, they are going to try to save the media, but perhaps they don't do that only because they like the media, but because they want to have, some political influence. And I will discuss this issue, of money in the media and money in politics, and which are the problems that are linked, in fact, to the fact that you can have 100 people in each country in the world that are able to buy the political parties and buy the media, which is an issue for the quality of democracy. And then we are going to discuss, I would say, the better solution to the media crisis, and especially the issue first of government intervention, and especially non-profit media. And in the very last part, I will show you the model that I developed in my book in order to save the media. So let's begin with the media crisis, and I think there is a fact that needs to be reminded from time to time, the fact that to produce information, and especially to produce what can be called hard news, good quality information that is going to be useful for you when you want to vote. I am not talking about like entertainment. I'm really talking about like news, about like politics. If you want to produce high quality information, what you need to have is that you need to have some journalists. So the very first question we need to ask is that how did the number of journalists evolve over time? I'm going to present you some data for France and the US, and then we will see also the number for Italy. So if you look at France, in fact, over the very long run, so this is beginning at the end of the 19th century, until today. Over the very long run, we see an increase in the total number of journalists, whether you look at the number of journalists, this is the blue line, or whether you normalize the number of journalists by the working population, and in this case, this is the red line. So you know at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, there were less than 10,000 journalists in France. This was kind of pretty flat during the first half of the 20th century, and then we see kind of a big increase. And then, in fact, you know, something that we see a little bit, but not so much because of the scale, is the fact that since the last 10 to 5 years in France, we have a decrease in the number of journalists. So there were 37,000 journalists in France 5 years ago. Now there is around like 35,000 journalists, and in fact, each year we see a decrease by 1,000 in the total number of journalists in France. This is kind of the very first fact. The second question you can ask when you see this kind of data is whether this is a good way, you know, to measure the fact that perhaps we are more informed today than we were in the past. And the question is, do we need to look at the absolute number of journalists? Do we need to normalize the number of journalists by the working population? Or in fact, won't it be better to normalize the number of journalists by all the intellectual professions? So, you know, you don't consider the entire working population, but you look at the number of, like, teachers, professors, all the people working, lawyers, like in intellectual professions. And in fact, if you do that, what you see, you know, is that this increase in the number of journalists may perhaps just reflect the increasing importance of knowledge workers. So I will show you the same graph, but rather than normalizing the number of journalists by the working population, I'm going to normalize the number of journalists by the knowledge workers. And here is what you find. In fact, you find that once you consider the number of journalists as the share of all the knowledge workers in France, we have a decrease in the total number of journalists since 1960. So for more than 50 years now, in fact, we see a decreasing trend in France in the total number of journalists. Which means that in a society that is like more and more complex, in which we are doing like more and more research, in which people are more and more educated, in which they want to know more and more about like politics, about what is happening in the world around them. In fact, we are devoting, you know, less people, and in fact, I will show you we are devoting a lower share also of GDP to inform the population. Okay? And so as a share of the like knowledge workers, we see a long-term decline in the number of journalists. This is the case for France, but in fact, I'm going to show you evidence for other countries in which we saw this same kind of figures. Okay? The thing is that these are all the journalists. So you have here the journalists working for general information newspapers, you have journalists working for TV, you have journalists working for radio, you also have journalists working for some magazines, and some magazines are not going to be like about like general information, but more about like entertainment, for example. So what is happening in the data, if we look just at the number of journalists working in general information newspaper, it will be La Stampa, La Repubblica, El Corriere della Sera in Italy, for example. Okay? If you do that, in fact, what we find, and we can switch to the US, we find, in fact, that we have a very long-term decline since 1990. If you look at the number of journalists working for general information newspapers, you have more than 55,000 in the US in 1990. As of today, you know, you just have like a little bit more than 35,000. So, in fact, within 20 years, we saw a decrease by 20,000 in the total number of journalists working for daily newspaper in the United States. And if you normalize this number just by the working population, in fact, you see that this decline began in the middle of the 1980s. And if I were to normalize by the total numbers of knowledge workers, you will see even a stronger decline in the number of journalists. Okay? Just, in fact, between 2008 and 2014, we saw a decline by 15,000, you know, within 10 years, we saw a decline by 15,000 in the total number of journalists working in the United States. And if you see what is happening in the US, it means that a number of like newspapers are just like closing. So there were a number of cities with local newspaper in the US, and now there is no longer any newspapers in these cities. So this may give rise to some issue of corruptions, and like if like local governments are behaving like poorly, we won't have any journalists to check them. And then this is not only I will show you about like some newspapers that are just like closing. This is also about the fact that a number of newspapers are going to, in fact, reduce their own newsroom. So this is about the US. Before I show you the number about France, so what is happening if you look at an international comparison? So you look at the number of daily newspapers journalists as a percentage of the working population in a number of countries in the world. So I took France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the US. Overall, you will say that the figures are pretty similar everywhere, okay? But the one country that is doing the worst within these 5 countries, in fact, is Italy, in which, as a share of the working population, you have the lower number of journalists, okay? This is due in part, and this also explains why Japan is doing much better than the rest of the countries here. This is due in part to the rather low penetration, circulation, as a share of the population of Italian newspapers. Okay? If you look at newspapers' readership as a share of the population in Italy, it's lower than in France, it's lower than in Germany. But if you compare France, Germany, and the US, in fact, it's also much lower than in Japan. And in Japan, this is a country where we have a much higher, in fact, share of newspaper circulation, newspaper readership, compared to the population, and this has, as a direct consequence, in fact, the fact that the number of journalists as a share of the working population is also higher in Japan than in Italy or in other European or developed countries like the United States. Okay? What is kind of striking is that this decrease in the number of journalists is not only due to a decrease in the number of media outlets, it's also due to a decrease in the number of journalists by media outlets. Okay? It's due to a decrease in the size of the newsroom. So, for example, in the US, the average number of journalists per newspaper in 2001 was 39. In 2030, it's 27. So, in fact, in 10 years, we saw a reduction by 1/3 in the average size of the newsroom in the US. So, you know, then when you compare different newspapers, in general, people, so let's talk a little bit about France. Like the main newspaper in France is supposed to be Le Monde, okay? The size of the newsroom of Le Monde is lower than 400 journalists, okay? And in general, people in France, they tend to say, oh, Le Monde is not a good quality newspaper. And if you compare Le Monde to the New York Times, they are doing much better at the New York Times. So like, French journalists may be of pretty bad quality. But in fact, the size of the New York Times newsroom is higher than 1,000 journalists. So obviously, they are doing much better than Le Monde. Not because American journalists are better qualified than French journalists, but just because there are more journalists in the New York Times than journalists working for Le Monde. And you will see exactly the same difference if you compare, you know, the quality of El Corriere della Sera with the quality of the New York Times. The quality of El Corriere della Sera may be considered as lower because you have less information, and especially you will have less information about international politics. But this is mainly due to the fact that the newsroom of El Corriere della Sera is much lower than the newsroom of the New York Times. Okay? So this decrease in the size of the newsroom, in fact, has a direct impact on the quality of the information produced by each newspapers. You can ask me, in fact, why do we care about this decrease in the size of the newsroom? You really have to think about the media industry as being an industry with increasing returns to scale. Okay? If you take the car industry, for example, if you were selling 1,000 cars with 100 employees, and tomorrow there is a crisis for the car industry, okay, and then you are just going to sell like 500 cars, then you can diminish, in fact, your number of employees by half. And you will have like 50 persons working to produce your 500 cars, okay? This is a bad news for the firm, but this is not going to decrease the quality of the car. The quality of the car will be the same, because in fact, if you want to produce more cars, you need to have more employees. Now, let's think that you are a newspaper, and you are a newspaper with 100 journalists. And tomorrow you have a crisis. You have a decrease in advertising revenues, or you have a decrease in circulation. In both cases, you have less revenues, so you need to reduce your expenditures. Okay? So if now, in order to reduce your expenditure, you decide to decrease the size of your newsroom by half, and you will have 50 journalists, then this is not like for the car industry. You face the big issue. And the big issue is that you won't be able to produce as much information with 15 journalists than you produce with 100 journalists, okay? And you are going to decrease the quality of your newspapers, which will have direct consequences for the information available to the readers. Okay. So how to explain this long-term decline that we see in the total number of journalists? The first reason I want to discuss is the fact that we are facing a long-term decrease in advertising revenues. These are the total advertising spending in Germany, US, and France since 1980. When I say total advertising spending, is really how much a society is spending on advertising. So I'm considering advertising in newspapers, on TV, outdoor advertising, advertising in theaters, all the different ways you can spend your money through advertising. This was higher than 1% of GDP in the US. Okay, in the US, we always spent a lot of money on advertising. The numbers have always been a little bit lower for European countries. For both Germany and France, in fact, we have advertising revenues below 1% of GDP. But in both cases, what you see is that since the 1990s, there is a decrease in total advertising spending. So just the size of the cake, the size of advertising spending is decreasing, okay? If you look at the specific case of Italy, and if you look at the evolution of advertising spending in Italy again since 1980s, we see a decrease in the size of the cake since 2000s, okay? You will see in this graph, in fact, if I were to compare it to the previous one, then the advertising market in Italy has always been less developed than in France or Germany. And it's why the decline also began a little bit later on, just in 2000s. But since 2000, we see a decline of how much the Italian economy is spending on advertising. So this is the very first fact. Okay, even without focusing on the special case of the media, even without focusing on newspapers, just if you look at the advertising market, we are spending less today as a society on advertising than we were in the past. I'm not saying that this is a bad news, okay? This may be even like a good news for us. But you will see that this is a bad news for the media industry. Now, you look at newspaper advertising revenues, okay? So before I was showing you like the size of the cake, now I'm showing you the share of the cake just for newspapers. In fact, if you look at newspapers advertising revenues, they are decreasing since 1956 in the US. So this is not at all something new. People, they tend to say, the media crisis, like the newspaper crisis, is just due to the internet. And that's true that it accelerated a little bit with the internet. If you look at the figure, you saw a decline that is a little bit quicker since 2000 than it were in the past. So that's true. But in fact, the crisis began much before the internet. Because in fact, the internet, this is not the very first time that newspapers are facing competition. They began to face competition for the very first time with the radio. And in the US, just to tell you a little bit of a story, in the US in the 1920s, 1930s, at the very first time, in fact, the radio appears, the newspapers, they decided not to publish the radio programmation. They're like, no, we are not going to give any information to our readers, to what is going to happen on the radio because we don't want them to switch on the radio. So they were very aware, of the fact that they were competing with the radio. And after competing with the radio, they compete with TV. And now they are competing with the internet. So this is even worse. So you have two things happening. Is that the very first one is that the size of the cake is decreasing. We are spending less on advertising. And the share of the cake going to newspapers is also decreasing because before there were only newspapers and a little bit of outdoor advertising. And now you have newspapers, you have the radio, you have TV, you have the internet. Okay? And at the end of the day, newspaper advertising revenues, they are just decreasing very, very, very quickly. By the way, I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but some people, they say, we will find a solution to the media crisis, and especially to newspapers crisis, we are going to do advertising online. This will be the solution, Okay? But the fact is that they won't be able to reverse a 60 years long decrease just with online advertising. And one of the reasons why they won't be able to do it is that there is a digital advertising market. Digital advertising, it does exist. But digital advertising, in fact, the only players that are really enjoying this market, they are Google, they are Facebook, and increasingly Amazon also. And at the end of the day, if you look at the US digital advertising market, around $43 billion a year, the share of the market going to newspapers is less than 12% of the total digital advertising market. And at the end of the day, you have one player, Google, whose only role is to reproduce content that have been created by others, the media, okay? And the total revenues of Google are twice the one of the total revenues of all the newspaper industry in the US, okay? So Google is making twice as much money that all the newspapers together in the US. That raises kind of a big, question about first the financing of the media, but we are going to deal with that. And the second question that I am not going to raise today, but about copyright and the relationship between Google and the different media. So we see, this big decrease in newspaper advertising revenues. As a consequence, we also see that newspapers they rely today less and less on advertising as a share of their total revenues. And the decrease was especially strong in the US because in the US they always rely very strongly on advertising. For some newspapers, for some more than 80% of their total revenues, they were relying on advertising in the 80s and in the 90s. Now we see a big decrease in this reliance. And a newspaper like the New York Times, as of today, is relying for less than 50%, in fact, on advertising revenues. And the consequence of that is that if you look at the newspaper total revenues, you have a big drop. And newspaper total revenues at the end of the 1950s, they were representing more than 1% of the US GDP. Today they are representing less than 0.2% of US GDP. So they have been divided by 5. And again, if you don't look just at this 0.2%, but if you look at the trend, we don't really know what may happen, to see a reversion in the trend and an increase back in the total revenues of US newspapers. Okay. I have one good news, and then before I will try to, I will deal with the solution. One of the good news is in a sense that media outlets, they can survive without advertising, okay? And we see an increasing number of outlets. So this is the case, for example, of Mediapart in France that have no advertising revenue at all. They have no ad, okay? Which has also, some positive consequences because they are not suffering the negative influence of advertising. And when we saw what happened during the beginning of the year in the UK with the Daily Telegraph and HSBC, when the Daily Telegraph decided, not to cover the Swiss Leaks affair, just to please HSBC, who was, the main firm bringing advertising revenue to the Daily Telegraph, we may think that this is like kind of a good news, the fact that media outlets, they can survive without advertising. So what could be done? I'm going to begin, in a sense, with the bad solution, okay? The bad solution, in fact, are these new press barons. So, in fact, I say new press barons, but there were some of them in the past. And the most famous one that you all know, thanks to the theater, was Kane, okay, Citizen Kane from this famous movie. But we also have, some new press baron, and I guess that you know this one. So this is from Italy, and if you look at the US and in France, so if you look at the left-hand side, you have Jeff Bezos. So Jeff Bezos is the founder of Amazon, okay? And the founder of Amazon just bought for $250 million the Washington Post a couple of years ago, okay? So this is the case in the US. And in France, we have exactly the same kind of issues with two billionaires that are both of them working in the telecommunication sector. One is Xavier Niel, the other one is Patrick Drahi. And more or less they bought, you know, Xavier Niel Le Monde, so the main centrist, you know, French daily newspapers, and then he bought Le Nouvel Observateur, which is a weekly, but very important weekly newspapers in France. And then Patrick Drahi, he bought Libération, which is a daily newspaper from the left in France, like the one that was created by Jean-Paul Sartre. And I think there is a big gap, you know, between Jean-Paul Sartre and Patrick Drahi. And who also bought L'Express, which is the main weekly competing with the Le Nouvel Observateur. And just last week in France, there is this news that another big billionaire in France, Bernard Arnault, which is one of the close friends of Nicolas Sarkozy, you know, he decided to buy the second daily newspapers in France in terms of circulation. So now, you know, he will also have a newspapers before the 2017 election in France. So you have these new players that are entering in the game. And in a sense, I have to say that this is a good news because they put money in newspapers. Okay, there is money back in the news business. If you consider the fact, the Washington Post, before it was bought by Jeff Bezos, it was doing pretty poorly. Like during the 2000s, he strongly reduces the size of the newsroom, and he was losing money, and he was not investing at all in the future. They were not investing in the internet. Jeff Bezos, you know, not only he bought the Washington Post, but he also invested millions of dollars in the Washington Post. He hired journalists, which did not happen for like decades in the Washington Post. He hired journalists. He created a newsroom, breaking news newsroom, you know, which is working now 24 hours a day, okay? He developed and in fact he modified the internet website that is better today than it was in the past. So money is back, and in a sense, in terms of investment in news production, this can be seen as a good news. And we have other players, for example, Pierre Omidyar, who is the founder of eBay, you know, he also put $250 million just to create a new website, First Look Media. What I want to convince you today is that this can also be seen as a bad news, and at least this can be considered as a solution to the media crisis. And in fact, to make this point, I want to use a related issue that is the one of money in politics. Okay? If you look at a number of countries, and this is the case in Italy, this is the case in France, this was the case in the past in the US, there are legislations to control and to limit the amount that both firms and individuals can give to politicians or can give to political parties. And the idea is really that money, it can corrupt politics, and the idea that we don't want a number of people to be able to buy politicians and to buy their decisions. In the US, this is an interesting example because we can see the consequence of what just happened in the US. In the US, all these legislations have been removed during the last decades. Okay? Especially, they were like the very last change took place 1 year ago, in April 2014, you know. There were some aggregate limits on how much an individual could spend to candidate before 2014. It was up to $100,000 every 2 years in the US, which is already, you know, I'm not able to give that to a candidate every 2 years, you know. For a lot of people, this is a big amount of money. But the Supreme Court in the US, it considered that it was not enough. Okay, this was kind of a limit to freedom of speech, so they changed the limit, and now they allow a $3.47 million contribution per individual over a 2-year period. Okay? So now an individual can contribute for like nearly $3.5 million every 2 years to national party and federal candidate committees in the US. As a consequence, you know, there are a number of consequences. As a consequence, first one, in the US, we are spending more and more and more and more and more money on electoral campaigns, okay? And in 2012, just in terms of outside spending, more than $1 billion was spent by the candidate. You know, this number was just multiplied by plus infinity between 1992 and 2012. Just to give you an idea of what happened. if you compare Clinton in 1992 and Obama in 2012, just to give you one idea, the amount of money Obama did not spend in 2012, he received but he did not spend, is higher than the total amount of money Clinton spent on its campaign in 1992. Okay? So kind of a big change. Politics is working in the US. The thing is that this money is not given by all the Americans, okay? Each American is not given $1, okay? Just a couple of Americans are contributing to everything. If you look at the top 0.01% of the households in the US, okay, the richer households in the US, they represent around 5% of the total income in the US. The 0.01% of the income distribution. They contributed for more than 40% to campaign contributions in 2012. So this is not just about, spending more money in politics, but this is about like a couple of people spending money in politics, and the other, they are not doing anything. A consequence of it, this is just an example, I could have found others, is that if you compare the minimum wage in France and in the US, so the black line is about the US, the white line is about France. In France, between 1950 and today, we see an increase in the minimum wage, which is kind of something you could expect in a democracy, with growth, development, you could expect the minimum wage to increase slowly over time. In the US, what we see is that since 1970, just a decrease, not something like just stable, we see a decrease over time in the minimum wage in the US. And this is linked, I'm going to show you like one or two more graphs to prove you that this is linked to the fact that now you just have like some billionaires that are able to buy American politics. Okay? And the evidence I am going to show you is not from me, it's from a book by Gillens that is called Affluence and Influence, Economic Inequality and Political Power in America. So what he do in the book is that he examines the relationship between individual Americans' financial resources and their political power. Okay? So what can happen is the following. In fact, you can have four different situations. You have the situation, in fact, like on the top at the left, where politicians are not responsive at all. So whether or not, people favor a policy change, the probability that the policy will be adopted is exactly the same. So the line is just straight, okay? Then you have a situation on the right in which you have a perfectly responsive majoritarian government, where if less than 50% of the population favor the policy change, then it won't be adopted. The probability that it will be adopted is 0%. In more than 50%, if the majority of the people, they favor the policy change, then the policy will be adopted with a 100% probability, okay? And in general, what we should expect is kind of a 45-degree line in which the probability that the policy will be adopted increase with the percentage of people that favor the policy, okay? What we see in the data is the following. So the line with dot is the 10th percentile, so the poorer American, okay? And the 19th percentile are the richer American, the 10% American with the higher income. What we find is that when the 10th percentile and the 19th percentile don't have the same preferences on a given policy, the line with the dot is flat, okay? Which corresponds to a situation in which the government is non-responsive, okay? So they don't take into account their preferences, where they exactly follow, in fact, the preferences of the richer. Okay? So then you can tell me, okay, but this is just about comparing the poorer with the richer, but if you look at the median voter, okay, then perhaps the government is going to follow the preferences of the median voter. Like half of the population is big, no? It's bigger than 10%. In fact, we find exactly the same thing. Okay? The dotted line is for the median voter, the 15th percentile, and then you have the 19th percentile. And again, you find the flat dotted line and an increase. So, which means that there is no policy responsiveness to the preferences of the median voter when they diverge with the preferences of the richer, and the government only answers to the preferences of the people who have more money. And if you want to understand this representational inequality, you know, you can say this is not about money in politics. This is perhaps because, you know, the affluent Americans, they vote more, or perhaps they volunteer more in political campaigns. But they also donate more, you know, to political causes. And what we do find, is that true that they vote more, but they don't vote more, you know, than the median voter, like the increase of self-reported turnout with the average income of the American is kind of looking like a diagonal. You find the same thing if you look at the percent working in the political campaign, and the big difference you see in the data, it's again as to the average political donation. Like the big difference between the median voter and the 19th percentile is about political donation. To come back to the media, the fact is you have more or less 3 different ways to influence public policy. You can do it through political donations, you can do it through foundations, through think tanks, through like opinion shaping apparatus, and you can do it through financing of the media. Very often you have the same individuals that use the different tools. So Murdoch in the US, for example, is very well known for financing the Republican Party, but he also, you know, bought a number of newspapers and have his own television channel with a very strong bias, which is Fox News. Berlusconi in Italy also is doing the same things, no? But he's not giving like money to a political party, he's investing in his own campaign, and he also have his own like TV. What can be done? The thing is that it is feasible to regulate money in politics. You can have campaign finance regulation. We had in the past campaign finance regulation in the US and it was working, and we have campaign finance regulation in France, in Italy. This is not perfect, but still this is working much better than in countries in which you don't have campaign finance regulation. The thing that is much harder is to know what can be done to regulate money in the media. You can try to have antitrust regulation, okay? At least you want to introduce a lot of media competition. And I'm going to argue that non-profit media can be another solution. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to remind you that information is a public good, and the media, they really matter because they provide information to voters, okay? When you provide information to voters, you make voters more responsive to the quality of political outcomes, and this improves political selection, this improves incentive, and this improves political accountability of the government and the quality of policy. The problem of information is that this is a public good, and the public good cannot be delivered efficiently by the market. And this is one of the reasons why we need government intervention. Government intervention in the media, it exists in a number of countries, you know. It can take different forms. It can be subsidies to newspapers, you can have tax relief, you can have direct subsidies. You can also have like government intervention in the media through the financing of public broadcasting. So let's look at what happened in a number of countries. So for example, in a number of countries, if you look at the VAT rate, you will have a lower VAT rate on press sales, which is a way, you know, for a government to support the media. So in France, the normal VAT rate now is like above 20%, it's 2.1% for the media. In Italy, the normal VAT rate is 21%, it's just 4% for the media. So first, this is a way, you know, the government can support the media. If you look at the total public support for the media, you have different things. So the first way you can support the media is through public service media, and then you can support it through press support, and you can have indirect press support, so it will be like a lower VAT rate, or you can have direct press support. For example, if you give some money directly, you know, to the media. In this figure, this is kind of important because you see the differences in terms of public support for the media in different countries, and the comparison is easy to do because this is normalized in terms of euros per capita. So first you see that the country that spends the most on the public support for the media is Finland, then you have Germany. in France, we spend a little bit more than 16 euros per capita in order to support the media. In Italy, the number is pretty low, okay? For two reasons. It's first that the public money spent for public broadcasting is rather low in Italy, and then there is not a lot of support to the press, which may also explain why, you know, the number of journalists as a share of the working population is relatively low in Italy compared to other countries. The country in which it is even lower is in the US, you know, in which only 2.6 euros per capita is spent to support the media. Okay. Obviously, you can tell me, and I think this is like an important issue, especially here, you know, that public support for the media is not only kind of free, and there can be like some risks that are associated with public support to the media, especially, you know, if government want to intervene when it decided to finance the media, which may be the case of public broadcasting in Italy. So in Italy, you know that you have like two main networks. You have the private television network, which is owned by Berlusconi, which is Mediaset, and then you have the RAI, which is the public television corporation, which is a big concentration, because if you take Mediaset plus the RAI, in fact, you have 85 to 19% of the average TV viewership in Italy. There was a study, you know, of media bias in Italy, and especially to what happened to the content of public TV in Italy after a shift in government. And in order to do this study, Ruben Durante and Brian Knight, what they did, in fact, is that they look at the content of the RAI channels and the Mediaset channels after the 2001 change in government from the center-left coalition to the Berlusconi-led center-right coalition. Okay? So they look at the content of the Italian TV, and what they find is the following. First of all, they find a bias towards the right for Berlusconi private network, which is not so much of a surprise. You know, if it is a little bit like if I was telling you that Fox News has a bias towards the right, well, okay, but this is a matter of fact. More interestingly, they find that the public network is shifted to the right relative to the private network after the change in the government, after 2001. So this was not without a cost, you know, because of government support to the media, and especially the fact that in Italy it is done in such a way that you will have the government that is going to choose the head of the main TV channel, which is not the case in a number of other countries in which we try to preserve public broadcasting independence. Then you see a shift in the political bias of the channel after the change in the government. So we can have government subsidy for the press, and they are part of the solution, but obviously, you know, we need that the subsidy safeguards press independence. And in fact, what I'm going to argue is that the best way to have government support to the press that at the same time safeguards press independence, in fact, is through non-profit media. I'm not the only one increasing in favor of the development of the non-profit form of the media. Like a number of people are like doing it as of today, and we see, I'm going to give you a number of examples, like the development of non-profit media. The good things about having government support to the media through non-profit media is that this is not the government that is going to pick and choose, you know, a number of media outlets in order to support them, okay? Because these outlets favor the government. These are private donors, this can be you know, that are going to support, to give money to a media, okay? And then the government is going to support the media, in fact, just through the charitable deduction. So this is a way for the government to support the media without direct government independence, which means with safeguarding media independence. This is done for a number of newspapers that do exist in the world. One that you may know is The Guardian in the UK. The Guardian in the UK is part of the GMG, so the Guardian Media Group of newspapers, which is owned by the Scott Trust. And the Scott Trust recently changed its status, but more or less, to tell it in a very simple way, the Scott Trust is still a charitable foundation. Okay? The aim of the Scott Trust is to ensure the paper's editorial independence in perpetuity, okay? Maintaining its financial health to ensure it did not become vulnerable to takeovers by for-profit media groups. Okay? So, you know, non-profit media, this can work. And this works for The Guardian, which is kind of a big newspaper. This also works for another group, perhaps you don't know, like the name of the group, which is Bertelsmann Foundation. But in fact, the Bertelsmann company is Europe's largest media company. So this is a big and successful company. The Bertelsmann company is owned by the Bertelsmann Foundation, which is a non-profit entity. There is a limit to this foundation problem. The limit to this foundation problem is that, in a sense, this does not solve the issue of power. If you consider the foundation in the way they exist today, and the example of Bertelsmann Foundation is a very good example, you will have, let's say, a big family or a big guy that is going to give a couple of $100 million, okay, to set up a foundation for a media group, for a newspapers. At the same time they are going to set up the foundation, in fact, they also are going to decide which form the foundation is going to have, and especially who is going to have the voting rights within the foundation. Okay? And in fact, what we see is that we see a concentration of power in a couple of hands. Okay? So at the end of the day, the Bertelsmann Foundation is controlled by the Mon family, Mon/Bertelsmann family. It was the case in the 1970s, in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2010, and now Mon, like the first one, is dead, but his wife is having all the power within the foundation with his daughter and with his son. Okay? So the limit with the non-profit media statute as if it exists today is really the fact that we do not solve the issue of who is going to have the power and who is going to take the decision and who is going to use, you know, the media entity potentially to try to influence the way you vote or what you know about, like, politics, national politics, international politics, what is happening in the rest of the world. And my solution, and I'm going to finish with that, to this problem is what I call, in French, la société de médias à but non lucratif, which could be called, I think, non-for-profit media society. So the idea of this non-for-profit media company status is that this is at the intersection between public companies and non-profit foundations. Like a non-profit company, it must invest any surplus revenue back into the organization. But as we saw before, you know, there is not a lot of, you know, surplus revenue back for now in the media industry. The shareholders are not allowed to withdraw, which is something super important, especially in terms of press independence. And if I want to come back, for example, to the issue I raised before of Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos equal Amazon, okay? And he's the owner of the Washington Post. Do we see every day Jeff Bezos coming to the Washington Post and telling his journalists, you should cover Amazon in such a way? Obviously not. Murdoch can do that, huh? But Jeff Bezos is not Murdoch. It's a little bit like nicer, more clever than Murdoch, okay? But the thing is, the Washington Post journalists, what they do know is that they fear that if they cover the Amazon, you know, in a negative way, Jeff Bezos, he can just decide to withdraw the money. And in this case, you know, there is a big risk for the Washington Post journalists not to have a job any longer, which, you know, given the rate of decline in the total number of journalists in the US, it's a big risk for them, okay? So the thing is that they are going to internalize this risk and they are not going to cover Amazon at all, which is pretty funny. You know, if you want to study the content of the Washington Post during the last 2 years, there is not a positive bias toward Amazon. The Amazon company disappeared from the content of the Washington Post. Okay, this was just a way from them to be sure that Jeff Bezos is not going to withdraw from the company. And then through as in a non-profit company, with the non-profit media company status, you will have tax deductible contributions. As in a public company, there will be a lot of stockholders, each of them with voting rights. And I'm going to give you a little bit more details. The thing that is key is that in my models, the voting rights, they do not increase proportionally with the shares in the company. Okay? Because what you want to do is that you want to favor stockholders with a small share of the capital. So below a certain threshold, it can be like 1%. Stockholders are allowed to gather to form an association, for example, an editors association or readers association, okay? And they are going to obtain voting rights, okay? So they are no longer just considered as crowdfunders or donors, but they are really considered as stockholders. Above a certain threshold, let's say 10%, then the voting rights, they increase less than proportionally with the capital shares. Okay? So you reduce the voting rights, you reduce the power of the bigger stockholders. Okay? You may want to have some money by Jeff Bezos, and okay, if you want to invest some money in the Washington Post, it will be more than welcome. In fact, it will be twice more than welcome, because he will be able to take advantage of tax deductions to offset the loss of power, but then he won't have 100% of the voting rights, okay? He will have to share his voting rights with the voting rights of the Editors Association, with the voting rights of the readers, or with the voting rights of the citizens that will be willing to contribute to the capital of the company. And they will have some interest in contributing in the capital of the company because their voting rights are going to increase more quickly, in fact, than their capital contribution, okay? And then below this threshold, for the small stockholders, they increase their voting rights increase more than proportionally. You know, if I were to have presented you this work 4 months ago, in February, before the launch of my book in France, you can say, okay, this is nice, but this is kind of a dream. And we won't be able, you know, to reduce the voting rights of the big shareholders in order to increase the voting rights of the smaller shareholders. But in fact, now, like 4 months after the launch of my book in France, what I see increasingly, it's a number of journalists that came and see me, that try to create their media company, and that are writing their status is exactly such a way. Because what they want to do is at first, they want to share the power a little bit with their readers, okay? Because they want to reestablish the trust between the readers and the newspapers, because they know, you know, that they lost this trust in the past. Second, what they want is, as journalists, they want to have some power, and they want to be able to preserve their independence. And third, what they want to do is that they want to protect themselves against big shareholders that are buying today all the newspapers, more or less, all the big newspapers in France, that are buying a number of newspapers in the US, and I am not yet a specialist of the Italian situation, but that may buy like the main Italian newspapers in the future, especially because if you look at the Italian situation, you have a number of newspapers like in France that are owned, part of them are owned by companies like Fiat, that are not companies, in fact, that are devoted to the media, you know? So I want to tell you that this is not a dream, because this is happening a little bit. This will happen even more, you know, if like citizens are willing to invest in their media in the future, and I guess this will be like the best way to save the media. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a high-powered and high-speed presentation. I hope you got much of it. I'm going to start with a couple of questions. We have about 20 minutes for other questions. First of all, Julia, one thing about newspapers, and I've been in newspapers all my life, more or less, often they make a loss. Under your system, if a newspaper formed under the system that you've just described was making a loss, what would happen?
Under my system, but 2 things. I think that the very first things we have to do in the future is to think about like the economic model of the media, especially their relationship with like the internet, and whether or not they want to provide free content on the internet in order to increase their advertising revenues. And I think this won't be a good idea given the figure that I showed you before, or whether they are going to choose to have a paywall, which is increasingly done in a number of newspapers. This has been the case, for example, like of the New York Times, in order to increase their circulation revenues from subscription, you know, and to offset the decrease in advertising revenues. So I think, first of all, we have to think about media company as company that may be able in the future to make money again. I won't say that they are going to make a lot of money, you know. If you want to become rich, the best idea for you is not to invest in a media company, but I think they may be able not to lose money. Now in France, we have a number of newspapers or pure internet players that are making some money. Le Monde is not so far from making money. In fact, it may be profitable next year. We have Mediapart, which is a pure internet players that is making money. And the New York Times, in fact, they are not so far also from making money again. So this is the first thing. But that's true, you have a number of newspapers, and in fact, as of today, the majority of the newspapers that are losing some money. What will happen in my system, and what in fact is already happening a little bit with crowdfunding campaign to save some newspapers, is that if they are losing money, then they can ask money in fact to their readers in order to survive. So they are going to ask their readers to enter into the capital of the newspapers, you know, in order to have a chance to survive for 1, 2, 3 more years and to become profitable again.
The other question was, as I understand it, but I may have got it wrong, the people who put the money in, the investors, if you will, there is a democracy. They have a vote. They have a vote, to a degree at least, according to the money they put in. And they can vote on, say, the political position of the paper. How does the democracy of the investors work with the independence of the editor and the administration of the paper? What's the balance between the power of the investors and the power of the editor?
So, in fact, in general, you don't vote about the political bias of the newspapers. What you do is that you choose the editor. So you have a number of like newspapers, in fact, the majority of the newspapers whose investors have this right to directly choose the editors, and the journalists have nothing to say. Then you have a number of newspapers for which the investors are going to choose the editor, but for the editor to be named, he will need to have the approval perhaps of 50% or perhaps a little bit more than 50% of the journalists. And in the system I propose, in fact, not only like the bigger investors, but also like the smaller shareholders, so the investors, a little bit the readers, and also the journalists are going to choose the editor, which is in fact the bigger decision an investor can take in order to influence the bias. And not only, like this is not only about political bias, this is a lot about political bias, but this may be also about, you know, whether or not you want to have a lot of advertising, whether or not when HSBC protests, you decide to say, okay, HSBC, we are not going to talk about Swiss leaks, or you say to HSBC like Le Monde did, don't care. If you don't want to put an ad, we are going to deal with the Swiss leaks. So this is a little bit more than just about the political bias, but the big decision will be about who is going to choose the editor.
So, just one more question on that. If the majority of the people who have put the money in and who have the vote, if they, over some time, disagree with what the editor is doing, whether politically or in any other way, just don't like the way he is editing the newspaper, they can do nothing about it.
No, you have a number of ways you can fire an editor already, you know, in a number of newspapers. You know, you can think that every year on an annual basis you are going to choose whether or not to approve the editor again, or it can be on a biennial basis. But these rules, they already exist. The thing that we are going to have a different split of the power of the investors and a more democratic rule, you know, in order to choose the editor.
Okay. Please, lady there. I think you have to wait for a microphone.
Oh, no, but I don't like the microphone. I can speak more I am. You spoke about the independence of newspaper and media in general, and I was thinking about Charlie Hebdo as newspaper. And my question is, why in Italy we can't have a newspaper like Charlie Hebdo?
I guess when you talk about a newspaper like Charlie Hebdo, you are talking about a newspaper that is able to publish cartoons about the Muslim religion and this kind of things. But I don't know. I think perhaps there is not a demand for it, which may be an explanation. I think in France we have a very long tradition historically. In fact, back in the beginning of the 19th century, of some newspapers with cartoons. And Charlie Hebdo, this is a very long history. You know, at the very beginning, this is called Charlie Hebdo. Charlie is because Charles de Gaulle. You know, so this is really about the French history in which the newspapers, they were protesting, you know, against Charles de Gaulle, who were considering not a perfect democrat. I will say that this will be much more complicated in the US. Even if there is no law in the US that are going to forbid, you know, some newspapers to publish cartoons in the way Charlie did it, but we saw, you know, the way American newspapers, and this was the case of a number of journalists in the New York Times, you know, they wrote very strongly against Charlie Hebdo. I think this is not like that in a number of other countries. You can say also that there is a church weight in Italy that is much more stronger than in France. And Charlie Hebdo is not really about just having cartoons about the Muslim religion. The majority, the main numbers of the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo are against the church. So perhaps this will be a problem in Italy in which there is more weight of the church. Or perhaps there is something no demand for it, I don't know. But I think this will be a good idea to have one.
Thank you. Okay, great. I'd like to first of all congratulate Professor Cagé on the book, which I'm really looking forward to reading. It's so good to see younger economists working on the media, because I know John Lloyd and I have been reading a lot of the older ones for decades, and we need some new attention to this. So I'm really, really happy. So much. You're sort of modestly applying your work to the US and to Europe, but clearly it applies to so many countries that have gone from authoritarian media regimes straight to cronyism, for example, Burma or Thailand. Clearly there's elements here that really apply to the situation in Turkey right now. So I'm just curious, and obviously you've published a lot on Africa, I'm just really interested to know how you think this model could work in some of these new sort of crony media markets outside Europe and the US?
No, I think it will. I will have to think a little bit more about it first, because I have to say that I know a lot, if I may say, about the media in France, also a lot about the US, and I did work, in fact, a little bit mainly on Sub-Saharan Africa, which is kind of a particular situation in Sub-Saharan Africa, especially because if you accept two countries that are South Africa and Nigeria, there is no advertising market, which is a big issue for newspapers, and there is a lot of issue of journalists that are corrupted, but they are not corrupted, you know, because they are dishonest. They are corrupted because they are not paid by their newspapers, so they need to find another way, you know, to get some money just to live, just for their living. Turkey, I don't know enough about it. Obviously, I know all the issue, you know, of press freedom in Turkey right now. And in fact, in Turkey today, the independence problem is not so much with respect to private owners than with respect to the government. And this is a very, very, very big and important issue. But that's true that I think that in Turkey, like in Sub-Saharan Africa and in other developing countries, especially in those countries whose newspaper market is never going to be developed thanks to the advertising market, because there is no advertising market, and the advertising market is going to grow too slowly and is going to be captured entirely by the internet. You know, they won't have the historical times we have in France, in the US, in which newspapers they were relying a lot on advertising revenues, and then we see a decline because they were like new competitors, radio, TV, internet. In fact, there is everything at the same time for them, so they would never rely on advertising. That's true that in these countries, especially because they suffer much more from the issue of independence with respect to the government, which is first a big issue with TV and radio, but also with newspapers, I think it will make a lot of sense to have a direct ownership of newspapers by small players, by citizens. And from this point of view, perhaps it will be like even more important in these developing countries than it is the case in developed countries. But I have to say that in terms of having governments taking good decisions, it's like already very hard, to have some like legislative change, like in France. In fact, in terms of like non-profit media, it is also super hard to have the change we need in the US. Well, it won't be very hard to change the tax code. This is really about, like the fact that the government is not willing to do so. I think that will be even harder in these developing countries in which the media are doing in which the government are doing whatever they can, in fact, in order to control the media. I don't think they are going to go, at least, the non-profit things to have tax reduction to favor a democratic ownership of the media. But you can have my model without tax reduction. Then this is just about having, like media that are owned by a number of citizens rather than to being owned either by the government or by 2 or 3 big players, private owners that are billionaires that want to influence the political game.
Just to add to that, it is, as you probably know, a sad thought that in many parts of the world, perhaps most parts of the world by population, journalists are corrupt or living in a context of corruption. Many of them, as Julia Cagé says, because they're poor. In fact, they're often told, I met some journalists both in China and in Africa, who were told that they must raise the money themselves. There will be no pay. Just find somebody, write his story and ask him for money, and that's your pay. It is not quite true that they're all poor. There's some very corrupt, very rich journalists. When I lived for many years in Russia, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw some journalists getting very rich out of backhanders, out of money from the people who employed them or the people who they put on their television shows. You were the next, I think.
Thank you. My name is Blanka Shulava. I'm from Charles University in Prague, from the Czech Republic. And actually what's been happening in Italy is quite a good experience for us because we had a similar involvement. Our Minister of Finance is also the second richest person in the country and bought the big media groups. And besides this development, what was striking to me was that the reaction of young people was actually quite low. And I think it reflects sort of like a bigger development, and that is that we are so overwhelmed with a large amount of information and cheap information that it's actually the attention which is expensive. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe, if you have any insights on the behavior of my generation, on the generation of millennials, so that which could maybe propose a solution how to actually manage financing of newspapers and media while keeping them independent and sustainable. Thank you very much.
No, this is a very good question. I hope I am not too far from your generation. And I think we have to think about the way news are going to be consumed by the people that are today, let's say, between like 15 and 25, 30 years old, which we tend to call the digital native. And the thing is that the digital native, they don't consume information, they don't consume like the New York Times online, or they don't consume Le Monde online, or they don't consume El Corriere della Sera online. That's not true. If it were to be the case, it's okay. This is just a question of support. If they are not going to buy, the print version of the media, but they are going to consume the same kind of high-quality media online, I think in this case they will protest, and they will do what they need to do in order to support media independence and the quality of the media. Now I think there is a way, because in fact they are not reading this newspapers online because I think that this newspaper, they didn't have think enough about the way this new generation want to consume information. But just to give you an example, like the example is the one of Vice Media. So Vice Media, and which has, it's the owner of Vice News. This is kind of a strange company that is doing a little bit of everything. But at the very beginning, it was known, for like putting videos of cats, singing on the internet. This was not very serious. Then last year, they decided to invest more than $500 million in Vice News, which were their kind of news company. What they did with Vice News is, for example, they went to Syria. And they did very high quality videos. Some of the videos they did, one was about the Islamic State, was 45 minutes long. It got more than 1.5 million views on YouTube in a couple of days. This was information. This was hard news. In fact, there were much more in this video than what we found in a number of high-quality newspapers about Syria during this time period. And the people that watched this video, they were not like 45, 50, 55 years old. This was the people that liked Vice Media, Vice News in general, people between 15 and 25. But then the format was what they expected. And then they consume information, and they were interested about it, and they tweet about it, and they put a lot of links on Facebook about it. And I really think that the media companies, they really have to think about the way young people want to consume information. Young people, they are interested in information, okay? But they don't like the way information is offered to them as of today. And I think a lot of progress are made about that. Vice is an example. Another example is, for example, the fact that there is this new agreement between the New York Times and Facebook. And now, rather than having to click on a link to a New York Times article, you can get access to the entire New York Times article directly on your Facebook, which is an easier way to consume information. You have now a number of agreements between some newspapers and Snapchat. Snapchat, I think if you are like above 17 years old, you will never use a Snapchat, okay? But then this is a way for people that are between like 12 and 17 to consume some information, and they are going to receive some article on Snapchat, and they like it because they like this way of receiving information, and they're going to consume high quality information. So I think they may fight for high quality information if media companies are to offer high quality information to them. So first they have to think and to really believe that young people that are interested in information, but then they have to think strongly about what is the best way to deliver high quality information to this new digital native generation.
You're from the Czech Republic, you said. Are you disappointed in the way in which the media have developed in the Czech Republic over the last, 20 years is a long time since you don't look much older, but are you disappointed in the way that it's developed?
Well, no, I wouldn't say I'm disappointed because, as you said, it's been 26 years since we have independent media, sort of. But a trend which is happening right now, I would say that since 2014 there is a crisis of media and especially of investigative journalism, and reflects the research you've done. There is a decreasing number of journalists, and I feel like it's a vicious cycle where you don't become aware because you don't have the information. So it's sort of what's striking to me is that not that many people are actually concerned. Not that many people are actually aware of what's happening. So that's why I was asking, because I completely agree that it's more the failure of current big newspapers and media companies which just are not able to deliver the news in a right way, more than anything else.
Thanks. Anyone else want to come in before we end? If not, this has been a really stimulating presentation. As I said, the book is going to be published this year or next? This year. Next year by Bompiani. I would recommend that you buy it, and especially since, as Giulia Cagé has suggested, Italy has not in the last while been the best place for independent journalism. for a variety of reasons, but one of them you saw the photograph on the slide. Yet it does have some extremely good newspapers and extremely good journalists. There's no reason why there can't be good journalism, why there is some good journalism, why it can't be better. And one of the ways, perhaps, it could get better would be to get out of what in Italy is a particular part of the media context, which is that most of the big newspapers and all the private television are owned by big companies or by big people like Berlusconi, but not just Berlusconi. As Giulia mentioned, there's Fiat on Stampa, there's the Espresso Group for Repubblica. I write for Repubblica, so of course I think it's a great newspaper, but it's all companies, nearly all companies, except now there is beginning some very good websites. One of the ones which I like a lot is Dagospia, which is about gossip. Everybody likes gossip. And also for economists like Giulia Cagé, there's a very good one called La Voce, which is written mainly by Italian academic economists, both in Italy and elsewhere. So you're getting a kind of a renaissance, I think, of journalism in this country as elsewhere through the internet. But for journalists and for the public to consider the kind of ideas which she has put out, I think, would do our profession, my profession, journalist profession, and the reading, viewing public, both young and old, a lot of good. So our thanks to you again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Good. Have you got, is this presentation especially for here?
It would get going.
If you come to